So we're going to be going over the results of my MA thesis, which I completed last summer and graduated from the program in October. And yeah, so tracing textile production tools through time at the farm beneath the sand. So first, some background. The farm beneath the sand, most commonly known as Goose or Gornunasamna in Danish. It was a medieval Norse farm in the Western settlement, somewhat southeast from modern-day Nuuk. It was excavated over a period of 5 years. There was a glacial river that was encroaching on the site, eroded part of the bank away, and some artifacts were falling out. Reindeer hunters discovered the site and let the museum know. Approximately 70% of the farm mound was excavated and it had excellent preservation. Thousands of artifacts were recovered at just under 4,000. 43 rooms, 8 distinct building phases, spanning almost 400 years. And each building phase is approximately 40 years or so, give or take. So just so where we can see where we're working with. So Western settlement, we're here. This is the site, and Nuuk is just up over here. So just southeast from modern day Nuuk. So first, before I can talk more about it, I need to go over the archaeological feature itself. So farm beneath the sand is a farm mound, and farm mounds are found in Norway, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland, with some suspected mounds in the Scottish Isles. Essentially, the farm mound is an accumulation of building materials for the turf houses, which would pile up over time as buildings were torn down, leveled out, the accumulation of floor layers. And then when they would flatten it, their pieces of walls would be stuck around the sides, and this would eventually build up over time. And this appears to begin around the same time as annexes were put onto the longhouses, that century. In Greenland, fewer are fully excavated and fewer are stratigraphically excavated, as far as I know. This is the only one that's been stratigraphically excavated, or at least the only one I could find anything on. And just so we can see here, this is the map after Goose was excavated. So each one of the different colors shows a different phase. So you can see how they were building over the centuries on the same site. So the orange one being the final phase, red being the second last one, so on and so forth. So the level of complexity is immense. Excavating this is a massive challenge. I don't envy them having to figure that out. So the aims of my projects were primarily to trace changes in the characteristics of the artifacts over time. Because Goose is stratigraphically excavated, it gave us a unique opportunity to do so from a medieval Norse farm site in Greenland. As well, I wanted to identify the primary textile production spaces and how multifunctional they were. And this was done by trying to attempt if there was a loom in a given space during any one of the phases. And lastly, I wanted to determine how representative this artifact assemblage is over the entire period at Goose. So were they using the same types of tools the entire time, the same styles, similar weights, designs, et cetera, et cetera. So in order to do this, I employed the theoretical framework of artifact biography and household archaeology. This is put very simply, but artifacts of social lives, significant and active social roles. These roles change over time, and the significance of the artifacts also changes over time. And in household archaeology, the household is the group, not the building itself, and it's broken down into 3 elements: social, material, and behavioral. So the demographics of the household, the material culture of the household, including the house itself, then the behaviors, the activities performed by the household with these materials. And it's the best way to see societal adaptation because you're looking at the smallest level. So people are going to adapt to different circumstances, first in the home, and then that's going to reach out into a broader societal change, or at least that's what this theory argues. So prior to going to Nuuk to analyze the artifacts, I received quite a bit of data from Gudmundur Olafsson. So thank you, Gudmundur. I don't know if you're watching this. And I use that to build the foundation of my database, also with help from Gudmundur. The typology that I employed here was Ingvid's Bruggen typology, which is the most widely used typology for these tools in the North Atlantic. And the Bruggen site is largely contemporary with Goose and also had a significant amount of steatites, loom weights and spindle whorls. And so I traveled to Nuuk to do the analysis, and just a fun little picture of my corner of the museum for 2 weeks, and excellent place to have coffee if anyone ever gets strongly suggests that you can think about decisions you made in your life later there. I analyzed 256 artifacts total, 208 loom weights, 34 spindle whorls, and 14 artifacts, which after the analysis, I concluded did not fit the criteria of what I was looking for. They were all in piles and piles of boxes, and they weren't very well organized. Many of these materials hadn't been looked at in 25, 30 years. So I not only had to do the analysis, but a lot more organization and relabeling and everything as well. It was quite the undertaking. So the analysis and the measurements, pretty straightforward. Thickness, width, weights, size of the perforation, marking any tool marks, any other characteristics. Lots of the pieces were heavily scorched. Some of them had several perforations. The only part that was particularly challenging was the loom weights. Because so many of the loom weights, as we'll see in a little bit, were made from recycled steatite vessels. And so they already had lots of perforations in them. They were sometimes very heavily scorched. They were extremely odd shaped. Some of them were, 3 of them were over 1 kilogram. Some of them were only a few hundred grams or less. So I used abrasionware and cordware as useful indicators, but I primarily followed the original interpretations from the databases provided by Greenland. And I just wanted to show a picture of what I'm talking about in case anyone doesn't know. So these are from the National Museum of the Faroe Islands. These are steatite loom weights and spindle whorls. And then here you can just see how this loom weights would hang all together at the bottom of the warp threads. And that will be very important in a little bit. But yeah, we can see here, very heavily scorched. So this is a recycled piece as well. This one potentially primary. And so when I'm talking about cordware, I'm talking about up here. The cordware, if it was perpendicular to the weights of the piece, would indicate that it's hanging. So I took that as one of the main indicators, and then abrasionware along the sides here where it's scorched, because they would all be hanging together. And as you would move the heddle rods, the loom weights would all shift against each other, so they would rub each other. And then scorched pieces would wear along the edges. And this was a very common find. Almost all of the loom weights that were made from recycled materials had this. So quickly, the Brigham typology separates spindle whorls into 7 distinct types and loom weights into 5. I am not going to go into too much detail about all of these there. I think quite clear. B and D are very similar, but otherwise it's quite clear, I think. These are 2 examples of 2 of the nicest pieces that I analyzed. This one, it's somewhat difficult to see in the picture, but it has very nice cross-hatching decoration. Triangles going up and down. And then this was the only loom weight with a rune on it. I had a few others that had some crosses, one with a deeply incised circle, but this was the nicest piece. Importantly, you'll see on the loom weights that type X does not have a shape, because type X is reserved for highly irregular pieces that don't fit any of the others. And Odia did this, and I did this as well. Basically, it's saved for pieces that are recycled, so they weren't intended to be loom weights, but were used as loom weights later on. So getting into the spindle whorls, the entire assemblage was steatites, and Brigham types A and B were the most common, with B being the only one present in the all phases. 59% of the spindle whorls were from the final building phase, 20 of the 34. And approximately 55 of them were made from reworked vessel sherds. 85 from the reworked vessel sherds, 55 of those from the final building phase. Although I suspect that all of the spindle whorls are made from reworked vessel sherds, but the ones that I determined to be primary or unknown just didn't have the characteristics I was looking for, which was curvature on the bottom and heavy scorching. They didn't have that, then I couldn't be entirely certain, but they all fell into the thickness category between 1.5 to 2.5 centimeters, which fits with the reuse from steatite vessels. So the average weight, 24.4 grams, and very few were decorated. Only 9 of the 34, and almost all of those from the last building phase. Interestingly, here and different from some of the other sites, particularly in the Faroe Islands and then here in Iceland, there's a sharp drop off after about 30 grams or so, whereas at sites here in Iceland, such as Hofstad, you actually have the highest peak being between 25 and 45. But here there's a sharp peak and it drops off. However, these spindle whorls of these sizes, particularly from 20 to 35 grams, could have been used to produce a wide variety of thread gauges, as discussed by Ingoldoya in her many books and publications. So here are just some nicer photos of some of the nicer pieces. This was the one that I showed earlier, so you can more clearly see the triangles and the cross-hatching and the decoration. This was the only one to be in a protective little box. It was the first one I analyzed. And then this one here has like a stepped design and a collar around the top, and several of them had these collars. And then there are some other just not quite so nice. I'm just trying to show here the variety of the spindle whorls. They came in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And then this one here is my particularly favorite one. This one is actually a spindle whorl being made while it was deposited. So you can see how they bored the perforation first, and then they're actually undercutting the sides and working around the edge in order to create a spindle whorl. And the picture doesn't do it justice, but there was an undercut here. So you can see where someone had been taking a knife or a tool and actually scraping the sides away to get the shape first, and then the sides would peel away. So I just thought that was very interesting. At least that is how I interpreted it. So the loom weights, like the spindle whorls, all steatites, with brigand type X being the most common, 60% of all of them. So you can see on the chart there, and it absolutely dwarfs all the other categories. About 55% of the loom weights were from the final building phase, and about 65% of them were made from reworked vessel sherds. So highly significant portion. Their average weight was about 409 grams, but as you can see, there was a wide variety in the weights with some quite significant outliers. And we see one decrease in phase 2 and one increase in phase 8, although I don't suspect that those are anything very important. As we can see here, there were not very many loom weights from either of those phases. Phase 2 or phase 5, there's 8 and 5 total, about 114 from phase 8. So I think this is just a question of numbers, not a question of any changes in the proportions of the loom weights during those phases. And so here are some pictures of loom weights that I determined to be primary loom weights. They have very few tool marks on them, basically just the perforations, and some markings around the perforations like this one. There's an attempted perforation that was stopped. And you can see they all have a distinct spot made, or a part that was already a part of the stone itself that was convenient for putting a perforation through. And then we have 2 more that I determined to be primary makes. This one I actually believe to be a foot on the bottom of a vessel or a handle on the side of the vessel. Yeah, there were several like this with large protuberances, I guess, sticking off the side. The perforation is up here on this side. The inside curved edge there, likely the inside of the vessel, is heavily scorched. And this was quite a common shape to find in them. And then this one was decorated with a cross here in the middle. One of only 2. And here's just a very good profile picture where you can see how many were made from vessel sherds. This is the rim. And then there was a discrepancy in the amount of decorated loom weights. There were only 6 that were decorated intentionally. Most of the decorated ones, there was 14 total, were decorated with along the rim. So we have another one here that's was a vessel sherd that was decorated along the rim with 2 striations, which were probably a part of the original vessel itself, not an intentional decoration on the loom weights. So the second part of the analysis was textile production spaces, and you'll have to forgive my shoddy map making. I had about a month or so to figure out intrusus. It's not the simplest. But I wanted to locate the looms, and so I determined that in order to do that, following what several other people did, I needed to find clusters of loom weights or pieces of loom itself. There's a wide variety of the number of loom weights that people have used in order to determine whether or not a loom was present, anywhere from 3 to 30, I found in the literature. So I determined that 10 or more, a good moderate point, but also because I had so many made from reworked vessel sherds, there were several of them that potentially could have been misinterpreted, so I didn't want to go too low. And then I took all the other artifacts from the sites, did a desktop analysis, and separated them into use categories such as games of leisure, steam-type vessels, structural components, textile production, toiletries, so on and so forth. Just so that we could determine the multifunctionality of these rooms where textile production tools were found. So these two rooms here are notable exceptions, room 33 and room 6-1. So phase 1, phase 5. Room 33 was interpreted as a pit house, which we know from work by Karen Milek, I believe. That's how you say it properly. I don't know. She did quite some good work on pit houses and was able to show that they were likely spaces of textile production. And this is how this has been interpreted by Gudmund Olafsson as well. I've spoken with him about this. And then room 6.1 was also interpreted as a textile production space. However, both of these spaces only had 4 loom weights found in them and not in clusters, but spread across the room. So by my criteria, I could not say whether or not these were candidates for having a loom and therefore specialized spaces of textile production. But they were good candidates. So I was able to determine that 4 of the rooms in phases 5, 6, 7, and 8 were textile production spaces. All of them had similar multifunctionality, very high amounts of textile production tools and textile remnants themselves. All of them had clusters. So we can see here in phase 8, room 5-2 had a cluster of loom weights against one wall, and the same room 5-1 in the previous phase had a cluster in the same spot. And then we have room 1-2 from phase 8. And there are pieces of the loom here, again, sorry for the map, and a significant amount of loom weights throughout the entire room. So it is inarguable that room 1 was a textile production space, and room 5-2 and 5-1 as well. So the first aim of my thesis was unachievable. I was not able to determine if there were changes over time due to stratigraphy, just because the higher proportions of materials from the final phase versus all the other phases, there weren't enough materials in order to actually make a good comparison. I can't compare 114 loom weights from one phase to 3 loom weights from another and say that there were changes over time. That's just doesn't make any sense. So I did fail there. However, what was clear is the high proportions of reworked vessel sherds, which I think allows us to get a good glimpse into the chain of operations in the production of these tools. I think it's likely that they were anticipating that the steatite vessels would break over time and then they would reuse the materials. Steatite was a material known in Western Norway, Shetland, the Faroe Islands. They brought it here to Iceland as well. And then they found more quarries in Greenland. So this was a material that they had known about for generations that people had consistently been using. So yeah, it was likely anticipated that they would break and then they could reuse them for these other forms. Why go to a quarry and get little tiny pieces to use for a spindle whorl when you know this pot is going to break in 6 months or a year or whenever, and then you can use the smaller pieces from it. The second aim, it wasn't possible to determine the primary location of textile production in the first 4 phases. Like I said, there just were not enough loom weights for me, based on the criteria of this study, to determine that any of the spaces in the first 4 phases were associated with textile production. However, the final 4 phases, I was able to determine 4 rooms that were good candidates, one of them being an absolute certainty given the remnants of the loom itself in room 1.2. So the textile production in these phases was always located in the main living space, and it wasn't isolated from the rest of the household. So they were all highly multifunctional spaces. I didn't go into details with the demographic divisions or anything. It was a bit beyond the scope of what I did, and others have researched this in detail. There is a potential increase in textile production at Goose after 1250. That is when we start to see the textile production artifacts increase in proportion, and we also see an increase in sheep versus goats at Goose in the zooarchaeological record, which is counter to all other sites in North Greenland at this time where goats were actually increasing compared to sheep. So it is potential that there was an increase in textile production at this time. And then we also have an increase in clarity of textile production spaces, these four here. So third aim, phase 8 likely represents a full household setup of tools and material objects. So everything left in situ, they got up and they left. The increased proportions of textile production tools and clarity in the spaces, I think, is actually a symptom of preservation bias. And we see this as well at Storeborg. Only 3% of the artifact assemblage is from pre-1300 AD. And all the rest of it is from after that. So we see the same as you get later on in time in the farm mound. You get more and more artifacts. And so I think that the farm mound formation processes are actually having an impact on archaeological assemblages. And as the farm mound develops over time, people are losing more pieces, or they are getting deposited into rooms used as middens later on. The increasing complexity of the buildings is leading to more loss. Yeah, so this is a very simplified picture that I made very quickly on farm mound formation. So you have your main farm, and then the farm mound grows over time. And with that, the number of artifacts increases as the farm mound gets larger. So, like I said, I determined that it was probably farm mound formation processes themselves that are the cause of the extremely high proportions of loom weights and spindle whorls in the final phase versus earlier phases. More farm mounds will need to be excavated stratigraphically in their entirety to help corroborate this suggestion. However, this could lead to reinterpretation of the artifact assemblages from the legacy collections in Greenland. It has been suggested by others already that the materials found there are actually from the later phases, and that they either didn't get far enough down into the stratigraphy in order to find earlier phases, or that because it was non-stratigraphic excavations, everything was just lumped together. But if this is actually something that is happening in the formation of farm mounds, then it could just be that these tools are just from the final phases or have been brought up over time. People are keeping certain things and then bringing them into later phases, moving them to new buildings, so on and so forth. Yeah, that's all I have. That was maybe a little bit short, but it is.